over rocks and the mountain peaks, underground against the stream. If darkness does chase me, I found my way to God's country.
Hello everyone, Jordan here. I just wanted to put together a little dispatch before the end of the year. I've actually been watching a few of podcasts that I like do sort of end of the year lists. And I thought, hey, that might be a good idea for a quick little episode. I think they're good, they're fun. It's always nice to hear what other people are consuming for content. Anyways, I thought I would actually cover two top threes of 2023 that I had this year. But I wasn't just going to do a book top three, but also film top three. So now just a bit of a disclaimer. The books or movies don't necessarily have to have come out in 2023. They are just, I consumed the content in 2023. I either read or watched the film. Most films I watch are newer films, but yeah, I do have at least one film on my list that isn't brand new. Anyways, let's cover the books first. I love to read, so yeah, we're going to cover some of the books. And again, these don't necessarily have to do with the topic of the podcast, but I think there's some overlap with it. And these are just kind of my recommendations, and if you are looking for book or film recommendations, this is the kind of stuff I like. All right, so let's do books. My top three books, and I did list some 1 through 3 as well as the films, but starting at number 3, the third best book I read this year, in my opinion, was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. It was published first in 1952, and it's sort of a coming-of-age story of a guy who moves out west, just before the 1900s into the early 1900s, and starts his own farm. And I've never read any John Steinbeck before. This is his first book I've ever read, and I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's perhaps one of his final books that he ever wrote. Many people say it's not even his best, but I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was a really moving and deep book, and man, he knows how to write characters, and really imperfect characters too. Really, there's hardly any like flawless characters or characters that you almost couldn't relate to because they are so imperfect. And there's a lot of deep allegory in his writing, and really the story about East of Eden, you can almost, the title itself is almost a tell, because it's from the Bible verse. I can't remember exactly which, it's early on in Genesis, maybe the 5th or 6th chapter, 4th chapter or something, where Cain and Abel are east of Eden in the land of Nod, and it's what it is a Cain and Abel story. So the main protagonist, his name's Adam, go figure. But he moves out west to California and starts his own farm, and then he has these two sons through a very painful marriage that he had with a woman who left him. And these two sons are like deeply competitive, and one of them ends up, well, I won't spoil it if you want to read the book, but very well written. It's basically a modern Cain and Abel story. And I found it very deeply moving, and I would highly recommend anyone read it. Okay, coming in at number 2 was Maus, spelt Maus, by Art Spiegelman, and it was published in 1991. This book it's actually a graphic novel, and for me personally, I think graphic novels are a beautiful medium. I read a lot of them. I don't disparage. I think they're just as much literature as anything else. That's my opinion. We could fight over it, but it was also another very kind of beautiful story. It's about a father and a son, and the father he was a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps. And his father was really traumatized by this, and it kind of goes through a lot of his father and his mother's story, but it also goes through their own relationship between the Art and his dad. And it's actually like it's really a memoir. It's more autobiographical. This is Art himself. This is his own story with his father. But the way it is sort of illustrated is all the characters are actually animal characters. And so the Jews are depicted as mice, and the Poles are depicted as pigs, and the Germans are depicted as cats. So you can sort of see the imagery of cats predating on mice, just like Germans predated on Jews during the Second World War and the Holocaust. But it's kind of a tragic story, because he sort of really presents his father, Vladek, as being very traumatized, and that still affects him into the modern day, and really affects their own relationship with one another. And he's like very dysfunctional and kind of toxic to be around. And how but he's sort of on this journey. He's on this journey of like trying to understand why his father is the way that he is. And it's very beautiful, but sad, and tragic at the same time. But yeah, I would highly recommend this graphic novel. If you're not really into graphic novels, this would actually be like a good one if you're just into, books like that in general. This is like a very, I think, kind of a cool medium to tell it through. If you're not into like the whole superhero typical graphic novel thing, this is kind of a different genre, which I would highly recommend people engage with. All right, to round off the books here, the last and final book, my favorite book of the year that I read, was a book called The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser, and it was published in 2015. So this is the newest of the books, of my favorite books, top 3 books. And it's actually a theological, biblical studies book. So for those of you who perhaps aren't Christians who listen to this, I would say it is actually still very interesting, even if you're not a Christian. So Michael Heiser, he's really the subtitle is the supernatural worldview of the Bible. And what he really is getting into is the sort of premise is the audience of the original hearers of the Christian Bible, that they had like a very supernatural worldview, that there was this entire species, or not even, it's an entire world of unseen beings who exist, that and that like really colored a lot of the biblical perspective and the original audience and the original author's perspective. And he really goes into this. He talks a lot about ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian history in the Old Testament, especially around, the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and whatnot. And talks a lot about ancient Hebrew language and how that kind of gets mistranslated in our modern culture. So I thought this was actually just like a really enlightening book. It's really changed how I view the scriptures when I read them myself. and what the original authors were really talking about and how they viewed the world and how much sort of scientific materialism has infected the way that we think about the scriptures and think about the Bible. But it also it's sort of interesting as well in the fact that, there's a lot of, in the modern day, there's a lot of, bizarre paranormal experiences that people have that aren't even that far off from what is described in the scriptures. And I think that is maybe a little Easter egg for people to, if they're interested in looking further. But this is just like a really illuminating book and really tied together a lot of threads, especially with the very strange and bizarre passages of the Bible, the sort of passages that you will never hear preached on a Sunday morning. This book really gets into those and really expounds on what exactly those are talking about and what the worldview of the Hebrews were back in the pre-first millennium, in first and second millennium BC. And so, I think it was it was absolutely fascinating. It's completely illuminated how I view and read the scriptures. So I would I think it should be almost required reading for Christians. But even if you're not a Christian, if you're interested in, ancient languages and Near Eastern culture and Judaism and sort of a different take on how those people viewed the world and what their perspective was, I think this book would still hold up even with a secular audience. Obviously Heiser himself is a Christian scholar, so he's going to come at it from a more theological point of view, but there's still, I think, a lot you could get from that, even if you're not a Christian. All right. Let's move on to the films, my top 3 films of this year. Okay, we'll start with number 3. The King, directed by David Michaud, starring Timothée Chalamet. And it had quite a few cameos as well. Robert Pattinson played a pretty big role in the film. And it centers around the Battle of Agincourt in France when the English invaded France. What was it? Maybe in the 1400s or something. I can't remember quite off the top of my head. But this is sort of like a medieval period piece. And now, just to be clear, it's garnered a lot of criticism, and it actually doesn't have like the highest critical reviews. But when I saw the film, I wasn't really aware of the critical reviews. I actually thought it was a phenomenal film and just very beautifully done. And the pacing was great. And a lot of criticisms came from the historical inaccuracy of the film, and it certainly was not historically accurate. But a lot of people, I discovered, misinterpret the film because this is actually more of a film adaptation of Shakespeare's The Henriade, and that is Shakespeare's plays on King Henry IV and V's life. And so Shakespeare himself sort of wrote this historical fiction about King Henry IV and V, and put in a lot of like very typical Shakespearean themes of betrayal and father against son and whatnot. And so I think perhaps a lot of people misunderstood the film, and it wasn't supposed to be like a strict historical recounting of the events of the Battle of Agincourt and King Henry V. But it was in fact sort of a riff on the Shakespeare play. Anyways, with all that being said, I thought it was just really well acted. I thought I actually loved like the cinematography. I like the shading of the film as well. I think it's like totally an underrated film. So it's The King. So go on Netflix and watch The King. I think that's the only place you could get it. I believe it's a Netflix exclusive. But yeah, I would highly recommend people watch The King, especially if you're into that period of time. Definitely a good one. Okay, number 2, my second favorite film that I watched this year was Oppenheimer. directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Cillian Murphy, and that came out this year, 2023. And this is a biopic about the life of Oppenheimer, the sort of father. Well, he's known as the father of the nuclear bomb, though that's a little bit perhaps misleading. He sort of more led the project. He was more or less the project manager of the nuclear bomb, and it was really, if you look into the history a little bit of it, it was some other physicists who really designed the nuclear bomb, the guts, the nuts and bolts of it. But Oppenheimer was certainly no slouch himself, and he was very important, and he was kind of the lead on the project. It is just, so I'm full disclosure, I'm like a big Christopher Nolan fan. Like I have like 2 or 3 of his movies in my top 5 of all time movies. I even think his bad movies are still pretty good, like Tenet. I think Tenet gets, maybe, again, it's another one of those films similar to The King, gets unfairly criticized. I think it was like very innovative and bold. It didn't totally land, I think. The execution, the story was a little tough to follow. The characters were a little hard to be invested in, but I thought it was still a phenomenal and interesting and thought-provoking film. And I totally disagree. I'll fight people over it. Tenet was a bad Nolan film, but it was good for most other of the garbage that gets put out in films these days anyway. So yeah, I would highly recommend Oppenheimer. It's just, man, I just love Christopher Nolan's like visual style and storytelling. It's amazing how you can make a story like this so engaging, which you think would just be boring, scientists doing calculations on a chalkboard, but it really does present a good story. And it is actually still, despite maybe over-representing Oppenheimer himself as like the architect of the bomb, it does still have a lot of historical accuracies and a lot of historical events that actually happened that are pretty well sourced and documented. So if you want like a more historical film, Oppenheimer would be the film for you. Unlike The King, which takes a lot more liberties with what happened in the events of that film. But yeah, anyways, Oppenheimer, again, Nolan, he hits it out of the park. Highly, highly recommend. I think that everyone should watch it. That's just me, and maybe I just already have like a Christopher Nolan bias. There's a few directors. It's like Christopher Nolan, Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino. I feel like when those guys put out a film, it's gonna be good, even if it's not one of their greatest or in their top 5 films. It's still like, I'm gonna watch this movie and I'm gonna enjoy myself. So that's how I feel about Chris Nolan. Anyways. Moving on to the final, my favorite film that I saw this year, and I actually just mentioned his name, Killers of the Flower Moon, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring, it was really like a threefold cast with Leonardo DiCaprio, Lily Gladstone, and Robert De Niro. And it's about the Osage Nation sort of massacres or murders. It was a big scandal back in, it was just after World War I. It was maybe in the 1920s that it happened, but it's a tragic story. And Martin Scorsese is just such an excellent storyteller. And like most Scorsese films, it is a long one. It's a slow burn, so you have to be prepared for that. I did, however, find it felt like this one, even though it was still 3 hours, it felt like it moved better than maybe most Scorsese films. And I thought it felt like there's maybe a little more action and things happening. But it was a very tragic but yet beautiful story of what happened to the Osage Nation by this oil company back in the day. And you know what I liked about it too was it wasn't like woke at all or like shoving it down your throat that, just evil white man and like sort of the noble savage trope that you typically get from a lot of these stories that come out of Hollywood, especially when there's like a racial component to it. I thought it did a really good job of just telling the story about what actually happened. And there was a lot of moral ambiguity between some of the indigenous people. They were good and some of them were bad. And some of the American whites, some of them were good and some of them were bad, and many in between. I just thought it didn't feel like that. It felt like, even though it hit all the sort of like woke check boxes of diversity, of like this sort of like oppression narrative, but it was just a good story and it was a good film and it really, really worked. And it didn't feel like it was being shoved down my throat. And it was like my favorite film of the year. I think Oppenheimer was really good, but man, I think this was like the best film I've seen all year. I haven't seen all the films. I've seen a few, but of all the films I've seen this year, this is definitely my favorite. And yeah, I thought it was like really well done. It wasn't all that preachy, even though it told the story very, I think, forthrightly. I kind of read a little bit about it after I saw the film. But yeah, I would highly recommend watching Killers of the Flower Moon. I know it didn't get as much publicity as Oppenheimer or the Barbie film this year, but this was an excellent film, and I would just highly recommend it to anyone. And kind of a bit of a different sort of like the movie Silence that Scorsese did. It seems a little off the beaten path from kind of what he typically does. He came out with the Irishman a couple of years ago, and that's sort of a gangster film, and that's more of his like typical thing that he does. And doing this film, it was a gangster film if you see the oil company as a gangster, I guess a gang, if you will. But this is just an excellent film. So yeah, anyways, I'll just quickly recap. If you want to books I recommend, my top 3, starting number 3, East of Eden, number 2, Mouse, and number 1, The Unseen Realm. And my top 3 films that I saw this year was The King. My second was Oppenheimer, and my number 1 favorite was Killers of the Flower Moon. So highly recommend all those. Check those all out. I'm going to be working on more content to try and push out this year. So yeah, peace.